Europe and Latin America, old friends and new partners. In the interview, the president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera.
Mr. President, what significance does this summit have for you? What do you hope to achieve from it?
This meeting is taking place at a pivotal moment. We've seen Europe in serious crisis for 3 years now. Economic growth in Europe is likely to be negative this year, in recession. By contrast, Latin America is experiencing a revival. Most Latin American economies have learned from the mistakes of the past, so the continent is experiencing growth. It's creating jobs and reducing poverty. We want to enter a new chapter of relations between Europe and Latin America. We want more complementarity, closer cooperation, and more than anything, we want Latin America not to be perceived as a problem, as in the past, but as part of the solution.
Do you think the Santiago summit will lead to concrete improvements for the population and a more intensive dialogue between Latin America and Europe?
We want to establish a new chapter in relations between Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean nations. For us, it's about more than just a harmonious relationship. We also want to contribute concrete proposals. I firmly believe that this summit between Latin America, Europe, and the Caribbean nations will promote relations between the two continents and will bear fruit that will benefit Europe as well as Latin America. Latin America has everything, a huge territory with natural resources in abundance. There haven't been any wars like there were in Europe in the last century. We have a homogeneous population. So there's no excuse for Latin America being an underdeveloped continent where a third of the population lives in poverty. But Latin America is awakening. Its revival will be much more stable and take us much further if it has a wise continent like Europe, steeped in history, at its side.
The summit is taking place at a time when Europe is facing a deep crisis. Things aren't any better in the U.S. How important will the issue of international trade be in Santiago?
In Europe, 2012 ended with a recession, and the prospects for 2013 aren't much better. The recovery in the U.S. is very weak and very erratic. They haven't solved the problem of the fiscal cliff, just deferred it for a few months. Countries like Japan are also stagnating. The momentum has come from the Asian giants, China and India, which have overexerted themselves and hopefully will regain their full strength soon. But in Latin America, we're going through a very positive phase, not least because of the extensive democratization of the continent. Almost all countries have enacted constitutions that protect personal freedom and human rights. That's been crucial. And let's not forget economic growth and job creation. Take Chile, for example. The balance sheet for 2012 is really good, 6% growth. Unemployment around 6%. There's inflation of 1.5% with salaries going up, higher investment, a balanced budget, and we're becoming more integrated in the world. That means that despite the worldwide crisis, 2012 was a fantastic year for Chile. It's no coincidence, but the result of policies oriented towards freedom. That's key. The freedom for people to develop, to be innovative, to start businesses, to invest in science and technology. To achieve the highest possible levels of freedom, Latin America has to face the following big challenges. Firstly, reduce poverty and extreme inequality, and secondly, improve the quality of the education system.
One prominent European, Pope Benedict XVI, has criticized what he calls rampant capitalism, saying it leads to tension and conflict in today's world. What do you say to that?
It's clear that rampant capitalism is no more the solution than is rampant socialism or rampant religious authoritarianism. The word rampant refers to excess. What we need to do is seek balance. Because every society strives, or should strive, for the freedom of its citizens, the greatest self-determination with equal opportunities, so that everyone has the same opportunity to develop their talents, provided a society is capable of facing problems and challenges. The socialism we saw in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe before the wall came down wasn't a solution that matched up to those principles. The capitalist or Western system of the social market economy has its strengths, but also major weaknesses. For that reason, it's so important to have a state that puts controls on a free market economy, to reduce poverty and inequality, to ensure access to justice, to guarantee public order, and to protect the environment. This has to be done to make sure a capitalist society isn't rampant, but is a society that allows peaceful development.
What are the main problems you've had to face to find that middle ground for Chileans?
When we took office about 3 years ago, we were faced with three major problems. Firstly, the Chilean economy had lost its strength. Economic growth was slow, few jobs were being created, and investment wasn't at a high enough level. The second, we took office during a global crisis, and that crisis is still a threat. And third, a few days before the change of government, Chile was hit by a devastating earthquake and tsunami, which destroyed almost 20% of our infrastructure and buildings, wiped out our gross national product, and cost hundreds of lives. Those were the three biggest problems. But despite all of that, Chile was able to rebuild nearly 90% of the earthquake and tsunami damage. It got back on its feet and rediscovered its capacity for growth. Now we have a growth rate of around 6%. We've created lots of jobs and we're nearing full employment. Our unemployment rate is less than half the European average. At the same time, we've been able to achieve a macroeconomic balance that's allowed us to integrate into the world. We've increased investment, invested more in science and technology, and we've called for more entrepreneurship and innovation. We rely on personal freedoms, and of course we've put the necessary reforms through. Education and health reforms, for example. I hope we're going to see improvements in the quality of Chilean education and health.
The Europeans say they have trust in Chile and Latin America, but they also criticize the uncertainty of investments and the uncertain legal situations in some countries. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think Europeans are right. Because it's really important that there's a level playing field and that the rule of law is respected. In some countries, there are situations where basic trade rules are not adhered to. This, of course, creates mistrust and insecurity. I've always advised the Europeans not to regard Latin America as one homogeneous whole. There are differences. On the one hand, I've heard a criticism of Latin America that I happen to share, that inequality here is extreme. That's true. What we have to focus on is encouraging growth in our country, creating jobs, but also being willing to tackle poverty and rein in extreme inequality.
When people in Latin America talk about Europe, it's almost certain to have a connection with Germany.
I value and admire the German Chancellor Angela Merkel very much. She's a persuasive and courageous woman, and she has to govern in difficult times, as I do. Germany has always been very close to Chile. I value and admire the country, especially because I'm familiar with it. I've been there many times. Actually, as a child, I went to a German school here in Chile. It's a country that suffered a lot. You only have to look at German history, especially in the last century, 2 world wars. But Germany possesses strength and vitality. We're connected by common values and principles like love of democracy, of freedom, justice, the environment, and protecting human rights. The relationship between Chile and Germany is ideal at the moment.
The fact that leading European heads of state are taking part in the summit in Chile shows a real confidence in your country. What do you think about that? And what will you tell your compatriots when the summit is over?
I want to say this to my compatriots. Chile has chosen the path of integration with the world. That means building trust, seeking out free trade, working together in areas like science and education, and political dialogue. One thing that will be on the agenda at the summit is still lacking. That is structural reform of the international systems. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the UN were created after war and were shaped by that era. But today we live in different times. That's why we've always been in favor of countries like Germany, together with Brazil and India becoming members of the UN Security Council. And we have to modernize financial structures to avoid the kind of crisis we had in 2008. In this respect, we've made great progress.
Mr. President, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gonzalo.
Gracias.